before I had lived in the Midwest, and I was an East Coast snob with all the biases and bigotries that pertain thereto. A friend of mine and I, who is an imam, took a road trip to Indiana because we were teaching a week-long session at a mosque in Indiana. So obviously the drive from New York to Indiana is long, and it required us to continue driving or be on the road during prayer time. So we were somewhere in the middle of Pennsylvania, and my friend says it's time to pray. And I said, oh, we can pray in the car. And he said, no, I would like to pray outside because that is more befitting a prayer, and there's more respect for God in that. I was like, great. Like, where in God's name are we? And like, you want to stick your foot in a sink in, like, do we not know what's happening here, man? Like, I don't want to be like, I don't want to die casualty of God knows what, right? So fine. We get to this rest stop. It's like middle of nowhere, Bufu, America, right? And there's a big park outside the rest stop, so we've identified where we're going to pray. And he goes in, and he's got his foot in the sink. And then this guy walks in who, I'm just being honest about stereotypes, I figure is not going to appreciate this, nor my ethno-religious ancestry and tradition. And he looks at the two of us, and he looks at my friend with his foot in the sink and goes, shit, man, you've been on the road longer than I have. And then just walks out. Like, he didn't give a damn. He was like, okay. He was cool. And then he just walked away. He had zero concern whatsoever. And I was like, wow, for no reason at all, I judged this man. And he was just funny and just left.
Welcome to Avenue M. My name is Joey Taylor.
And I'm Haroon Mogul.
We're two men on a journey of faith and meaning. In each episode, we unpack the moments that shape us, the struggles that build us, and the questions that intrigue us. Islamophobia is back in the headlines, but maybe it never really went away. In this conversation, Haroon and I look at the recent targeting of Muslim communities in Texas and ask what this latest wave reveals about who gets to count as fully American. From religious freedom and foreign policy to the politics of fear and scapegoating, we explore why Islamophobia doesn't only harm Muslims, it distorts the country's ability to understand itself and the world around it. And ultimately, we ask a more religious question. What would our politics look like if our faith made us less afraid rather than giving us new reasons to fear one another?
The topic for today is one of the placards that went viral at a 2003 anti-war protest where a little kid was holding up a sign that said, I can't believe I'm still protesting this shit. Because here we are decades later and Islamophobia keeps recurring. It's the same kind of bigotry. It's the same kind of hate. It's the same kind of bias. But there's different reasons for it. And there's different harms it creates each time. This time, I think we are living in a resurgence of anti-Muslim sentiment. It didn't kick off in Texas, but Texas has been one place where it's been particularly potent. I do think it has a fair amount to do with the election, the success of Zohran Mamdani in New York. I think it probably has a fair amount to do with Abdullah Sayed's successful primary campaign in Michigan, and more generally with folks who no longer have a bogeyman they can point to distract from their own failures. So This is the same old Islamophobia, but also a new and different kind of Islamophobia.
So give me the specifics, though, of what happened in Texas that we're in part responding to.
By way of background, actually, let me start even farther back with a shocking revelation that might blow some people's minds. American Muslims are Americans and therefore behave very similarly to pretty much everyone else in America, right? We are affected by and pursue very similar things. Some of the particularities might be different. So, case in point, Texas has been doing really well economically, and this is something that surprises folks in blue states and on the left from time to time. But blue states have not done a very good job at making housing affordable or creating family-friendly neighborhoods and societies. It's really hard to live and raise a family in a lot of blue states because, principally, owning a home is almost certainly out of reach for most people, especially young families. So red states, on the other hand, have done a better job of that. Why is that important? Because Texas is booming. And when Texas started booming, it meant that Texas started attracting people from all over the country who wanted a better standard of living and a better life. We know that a lot of Californians, for example, migrated to Texas. And American Muslims are just like a lot of other Americans who found in Texas a great place to move. So Texas Muslim communities over the last several years have swelled in size, not because there's any nefarious plot at work, not because the numbers of Muslims are exaggerated beyond proportion. Well, they are exaggerated beyond proportion, but the numbers actually haven't changed. It's just distribution has changed. More and more people move to Texas, including more and more American Muslims. And that seems to have kicked off a kind of reaction. And the reaction includes opposition to a planned Muslim-centric housing development called Epic City in the Dallas, Texas metro area. That included most recently the governor intervening in and preventing the construction of new ablution stations in Texas airports, I believe specifically Dallas, but maybe Texas more broadly. In that regard, and I think this is the most important part about the Islamophobia, is that you can't separate it from what's happening in America more generally. So because Texas did certain things really well, more and more people moved to Texas, and Texas became an ever more diverse place. Mm-hmm. That's a consequence of economic success. You can't say that your goal is a free market and that you're better at doing this, this, and that, and then actually be better at this, this, and that without actually getting everything that comes with this, this, and that. If that makes no sense, I can say it over again, but
It makes sense to me.
Texas did well economically, so more and more people moved to Texas. Texas became more diverse. Why is that a problem? Because elections are coming and the Republican brand is in the tank, which means that a state that was kind of venturing towards purple territory is now maybe more affirmatively in purple territory. And so a lot of these folks who are fighting a rearguard action, who rather than confronting why they're doing so badly, are looking for someone to pin the blame on, someone to rile the base up, someone to distract them from their problems. In the case of Texas, that happens to be American Muslims. And it helps that there are prominent American Muslims like Zohran Mamdani, Abdullah Sayed, who are charismatic and compelling, coming from the left, who then you can point to and say, that's the real problem. Why that's a problem is never really clarified. What the problem is never really clarified. But somehow we can draw a line from an ablution station in a Dallas airport to, I don't know, more affordable rent in New York City.
Mm-hmm. In your mind, Greg Abbott is saying, I'm about to run again for the governor of Texas. The brand of the Republican Party is in the tank, and I need to figure out a way to rally my base. And so he finds some silly, completely tangential issues in order to rile up the scapegoating mechanism directed at the Muslim American population, specifically in Texas. That's how you would sort of diagnose his motivation.
I feel like that's a pretty fair conclusion. That's what it is. And so it's the bigotry, the bias is the same. The reason behind it shifts from time to time. In this case, it's not just rallying the base, though. I think in this case, it's an intentional distraction and diversion where instead of confronting what you've done wrong and what's not working, you're trying to replace it with something so that you can continue in power doing the very things that require you to construct a diversion in the first place. So I wouldn't just say it's a diversion, actually. I'd go farther. I'd say it's an act of harm in the sense that we are undermining the very things that make America great.
As a friend of you and of, Muslims in general, I care about this. But for people who aren't Muslims, who aren't maybe in relationship with people who are Muslims in America, why should they care about this? Why is it an issue for the broader American society?
The major reason is that because it effectively harms all of us. And the take I want to present here isn't the only take. This is not the only way that we can look at this issue. And bigotry, bias, discrimination on their own are bad and they are dangerous and they're harmful. But how they are dangerous and harmful also matters, because understanding that helps us understand what is at play in the world. And there's probably few forces in contemporary America that have been as harmful as Islamophobia. And that's a very strong and bold claim to make, but I 100% can back it up. So I'll give you a simple surface level example right now. So many airports in the world have ablution stations where Muslims wash before prayers. They allow you to wash the different parts of your body that you're required to wash before prayers. It's not really that different from the fact that many airports in the world have chapels, temples, meditation rooms that are intended to cater to all the diverse kinds of people who come through the airport. Why does it matter? Why is it a bad thing to take an ablution station out of the airport? For two reasons. One is you wanted to build a state with a competitive global economy. By definition, that means you're trying to attract and retain talent and attention from the rest of the world. There are consequences to that. If you want your state to be unattractive to the rest of the world and a place that people flee from and a place that is increasingly unattractive to live in, then you would pursue policies that would lead to that outcome, which in this case, it seems to be that's what the pivot is eventually going to result in. But it's also this simple underlying fact that the world is a diverse place. Get over it. Grow up. accept reality. There's all kinds of people in the world. Mature adults can handle that. We don't freak out. We accept that there's different languages, different ways of being in the world. And most people are more than capable of handling that, sticking to their own values, raising their kids in the way they want, building the lives that they want, while also respectfully engaging with the rest of the world. And if the mode of approach that we're presenting here is that our attitude to the rest of the world is either a middle finger or running away or going to war, that's a problem because it's unsustainable. And so I would say that I would draw a line from threatening Canada to banning ablution stations to bullying our allies to shutting down research and collaboration with the rest of the world. It's one of a piece of a bigger problem, which is the inability to accept that the world is just a complicated place. It doesn't require you to check your values, but it also requires that we respect everyone else's ways of being in the world. And what's even more perverse about it is that we're also talking about people who are fellow Americans.
That's where I wanted to go, because it feels to me like there is a question of foreign policy here, of tariffs, of geopolitics, of that kind of stuff. But we're not actually talking about that in this instance. We're talking about other Americans. And I think it feels to me like what's really at stake here, what's really under contention, is who actually is American, or what is American. And you started with this. Believe it or not, Muslims are Americans. But I think that really is, to me, kind of the core tension point here. One thing I'm interested in is the ways in which, I mean, you're friends with members of the Muslim community in Texas. You're obviously a part of the Muslim community here. How are people responding to this? I'm especially interested in how people are responding to this who maybe were sympathetic to the Republican Party in the last election cycle.
I want to go back to the airport thing, not because I'm fixated on that, because I think it sends a deeper message. And you're right that we should talk about how it affects Americans. But an airport is the place where you greet the world, but it's also a place where you say something about who you are. And so if reflexively you say, we don't want to build an airport that caters to people from all over the world, but just some parts of the world, what you're effectively then doing is you're also saying that who we are doesn't include that.
That's exactly what Greg Abbott is doing.
So those two things are inseparable. So if I can't handle diversity outside of America, I can't handle diversity inside America. Those things are inseparable.
Absolutely.
There's no such thing as a pure nation state. There have been attempts, and they've usually ended very badly. The major examples in American history, obviously the U.S., we went to war with Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, and then you have the Confederacy, right? An attempt to create a hierarchical racial state. Both of those, ended very badly and caused a lot of violence and massacre and disaster. So implicit in that is who gets to be an American. And you're right about that. And I think that the difference between this round of Islamophobia and previous instances of Islamophobia is that people are not going along with the presumption that they have to respond on the terms that are laid out for them. Mm-hmm. And this is a generational project. So it's not like suddenly there was a shift. It's that as people become more mature, and the longer we've had to deal with this, the more we've been able to think through what our response is. I actually think it's a beautiful thing that a lot of young Muslims, for example, have responded like a lot of young Americans by getting into politics and civic engagement and activism and saying, you know what, we're not going to respond to Islamophobia. We're not going to respond to bigotry against us as Americans of a different faith. We are going to respond by advocating for an America that is more inclusive. Now, you don't have to agree with the terms on which that inclusion is premised, right? Someone might fairly say, I don't think that Abdul al-Sayed's answer to X or Zohran Mamdani's answer to Y is the right answer. But the underlying values are what I would point to, is that I'm trying to create a city or a state or a country that is a better place to live for everyone in that city, state, or country. Right? It's not to say I'm going to come to power and then exclude these people from spaces and institutions. At no point has Abdul al-Sayed proposed that, Detroit's airport exclude chapels or certain kinds of worship. I mean, it's utterly ridiculous, right? And I think it comes to reveal, how do you respond to hate, not just what do you do with the hate in the abstract. It's not enough just to say that's wrong. What you have to say is, this is what we do right. And that's where actually I'm quite heartened and moved. A lot of these young folks came out of, let's say, college protests against the Gaza genocide. But they didn't go from there and retreat into an insular identity. Unlike some Muslims who, as you rightly pointed out, and maybe out of an understandable frustration with where the Democratic Party stood vis-a-vis the genocide in Gaza, assumed that maybe the Republican Party would be open to them. That position was pursued without asking a lot of hard questions about what you could get out of that endorsement or out of those relationships, things like that. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. Yeah, it does make sense. So once again, kind of speaking as an outsider here, if it feels to me like there's been a consistent current of Islamophobia in our national rhetoric. I'm thinking about recently Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar and the ways in which they've received backlash. And also, it feels like we're experiencing right now a jump in the rhetoric. That's totally kind of a subjective claim from my own sort of perspective. But do you agree with that? And if so, what do you attribute that rise to?
Yes, there's a jump. And I attribute the rise to a few different factors. One is the prominence of Muslims in public life. This is different. This is new. And so if the way you've approached and engaged Islam in the past is conspiratorial and bigoted and discriminatory, then it's not surprising that when you see evidence of American Muslims doing well, you just attribute it to a conspiracy that is now, quote unquote, bearing fruit. And so you'll say, oh, look at all these American Muslims who are coming to positions of prominence. There's something underhanded at work. We're losing our country. That's part of it, but that's not all of it. It's actually, principally, I'd say it's something bigger. It's a guilty conscience. It's an understanding that the politics that you've promoted have resulted in grave harm, that you've lost most of the country, that nobody wants this, that it's not only backfired on the terms you set, but it's set you farther away from goals that probably you share with every other American, like stability, prosperity, security. And rather than come to terms with that, rather than look in the mirror and say, hey, how did we get here? You're just looking for another bogeyman. Mm-hmm. You're effectively responding to a mistake by making the same mistake again. And that's why I think
you're doubling down.
Doubling down, exactly. And that's why I think that the part of the conversation we don't have often enough is how is Islamophobia harming America and Americans, which people often don't understand. Mm-hmm. And that part of it is, to me, inseparable from the doubling down, because it's not just a distraction. It's repetition of that which is harmful, compounding the harm.
And I see the Islamophobia that, we saw emerge after 9/11 and in a really vicious and powerful way result in incredibly harmful foreign policy decisions, result in economic consequences around who's coming into our country and who's not coming into our country. What other things would you point to in terms of how it's harming America?
Sure. Foreign policy is the obvious one. The only reason that people could be persuaded that Iraq was a threat to America and that Saddam Hussein was in cahoots with Osama bin Laden is because of a baseline Islamophobia.
Right.
They're all the same. They're all dangerous. It's all bad. And when you refuse to bring nuance to a conversation, then you collapse everything into crude categories. And if you refuse nuance in one space, you necessarily refuse nuance in every space. The idea that the country we militarily crushed in 1991, that was under suffocating sanctions, can and wanted to threaten the United States by collaborating with an ideology that was itself existentially opposed to its own ideology is bonkers. Like, who actually could believe that Iraq in 2003 was or would be a threat to the United States? And then we made a decision based on a discriminatory attitude, because people all over the world, right, knew that this was based on false intelligence. Everybody knew it. Even our own allies knew it. Some of them went along because they figured it's better to go along than not go along. But everybody pretty much knew this was made up. And look at what harm that caused. I mean, hundreds of billions of dollars, thousands of American service members died. Thousands more were severely injured. And we got stuck in a cycle of never-ending wars. And I'd say the Iran war right now is the same thing. And so the harm that's caused by Islamophobia is greater than any harm any of these enemies could have presented. Was al-Qaeda dangerous? Absolutely. Were they an existential threat to the United States? That's hard to believe. There's no country on the world that's as powerful as we are. But when we presume that people are motivated by and capable of things that they're clearly not capable of or motivated by, right? We end up in a situation where we cause ourselves more harm than anyone else could. This is the perversity of how it feels as an American Muslim. I was there in 2003 at all those protests. Wherever I could, as a 22, 23-year-old young man, I would tell people this is a bad idea. And even though I was opposed to it, when the consequences of that war resulted in movements like ISIS, like actually absolutely awful, terrible movements, they were still somehow, the blame was laid on at our feet. I'm like, well, hold on a second. Like, I don't support this ideology at all. I oppose the war that created the vacuum that allowed this movement to take root. And now I have to answer for those consequences. And so we never had an actual reckoning with how did we get here? What mistakes did we make? And it's this conflation. And so actually, that's where I'd say it is obviously important to note that American Muslims are American. And it's true. And it's also obviously important to note that bigotry about Islam and Muslims shapes foreign policy towards the Muslim world. But I think underlying it is something simpler, and it's just twofold. One is really what bigotry is an inability to apply the same rigor that you should to another group of people that you do to your own, or the same generosity, or the same complexity. And then that's where it gets dangerous, because once you refuse complexity in one space, you endorse simplicity, almost naive simplicity, in any other space. So if I can't look at this part of the world, if I think it's not important to be accurate about how I portray Iran, why would I think it's important to be accurate about how I think about vaccines or healthcare? It doesn't make any sense. It's internalizing an attitude and excusing an attitude that doesn't stay in its lane. That's the first point. And then the second point is that what it fundamentally does is it prevents us from actually talking about what's going on. If Governor Abbott wants to say, hey, maybe it would be better for Texas if this was a state people didn't want to live in, but you can't have it both ways. You can't have a state that is attractive to live in and that has a booming economy without then being a state that attracts both more Americans and more people from elsewhere in the world who want to come and do business and travel, whatever it is. I mean, then why were you hosting the World Cup? Right? Like that doesn't make any sense. You know, like you should be making it harder to build housing. You should restrict freedom of religion across the board. And coming up with these obviously cockamamie schemes that this is a religion, this is not a religion. I mean, come on, man.
That's where I wanted to go next, because one of the ways in which this rhetoric is sort of taking off is that, of course, our country was founded on this sacred ideal of the freedom of religion. And it seems pretty obvious that some of the decisions that not just Greg Abbott is making, but other people as well, is in violation of that fundamental freedom. And the ways in which they're responding to that is they're saying, actually, Islam is not a religion. It's a radical political ideology that doesn't deserve any of the rights that are afforded to other authentic religions in our society. How would you respond to that?
How do you respond seriously to an unserious argument? Really? I'm like, how? I mean, the very fact that Governor Abbott thinks he can define a religion while serving as the elected head of a state government is itself religion and politics. He's not allowed to do that. That's the theocracy he says that Islam represents. And that's the point, is that usually Islamophobia is an attempt to mask what you yourself are doing.
It's projection.
Yeah, 100%, right?
Yeah.
This is the same time we're talking about putting the 10 Commandments up in public school classrooms. So what is that? Then that's our culture. Well, then it's not a religion. It doesn't get the protections religion deserves. Like, what does that mean? Right? It's just we're throwing around terms, and that's where I'm saying it's harmful to all Americans. It's also harmful to Christians, right? Obviously, the many Christians who do not agree with that, right? But even Christians who do agree with that, right? Because now you've tied your interpretation of the faith to a sinking ship.
I just want to say definitively, I have not tied my understanding of the faith to Greg Abbott's understanding of the faith. I have not done that. But I do think there is something here that, like, obviously you're commenting here as a journalist, a political commentator, and that kind of thing. But you also have another part of your expertise that I think is worth talking about just for a second here, which is that defining religion, how it differentiates from political ideology, from culture, from individual identity. This actually is a really complicated thing. Theorists of religion, people who study religion have offered a bunch of different definitions of what actually constitutes a religion. Greg Abbott doesn't know he's weighing into this when he's trying to make these arguments. But actually, it's not that straightforward to determine what is authentically, quote unquote, a religion. As that kind of relates to this argument, I would love to hear you just talk about that. What do you think should warrant the protections of the federal government when it comes to freedom of religion?
It's that and. So it's that we don't have an easy way to define a religion. There's sort of a common sense way to define a religion, right? I mean, there are major religions in the world, religious traditions that have been recognized religions for centuries.
Yep.
That's one approach. The second approach is we can just look at the diversity of the country we live in and make some common sense decisions. We've got a lot of different belief systems here, and if we're going to keep the country functioning and address the problems that we all actually need to be focusing on, then probably we should recognize all of those religions as part and parcel of the tapestry of America, right? But third, we don't limit freedom of speech protections to religions, which itself is a theocratic assumption that is being introduced, right? Atheists have the right to proclaim and advocate for atheism, right? I don't think most atheists would say that atheism is a religion, right? I mean, some might say, it could be, it couldn't be. Actually, a lot of college campuses have humanist chaplains or secular chaplains. One might even argue that mental health care, the secular tradition of mental health care, is a kind of pastoral work, right? And obviously these are loaded terms, so I don't mean that one is the other, but we've not really ever restricted as a country the idea that what you say or what you teach can only be shaped by a valid religious tradition, right? Like we're not a country that says, oh, we're only going to have religious schools, but it doesn't matter which religion it is. No, that's not what we do. We have civic education that includes all of us, but doesn't limit itself to just what's in the room at any one moment.
I agree. I agree with you. I think the point that I'm trying to kind of make here is that we have drawn some
Sure.
boundaries around. Like I'm thinking of like polygamy in the LDS church, where we haven't actually allowed an expression of the Mormon faith to be practiced. Right. And so there are ways. I think what's happening here in my mind is that we do have kind of a gut response to what is an authentic and legitimate religious practice. We do. Everybody possesses that. And there are things that sort of fall within that and fall outside of that. And what Greg Abbott is doing and other people in his world are saying, actually, the practices of Islam fall outside of acceptable religious practice. Right. And so I disagree with that, obviously, but I would like to hear you say, but how do you determine that in terms of the imagination of a national identity? What fits in and what doesn't fit in?
That's a really good point. We don't prescribe polygamy. We don't ban polygamy. Only if and when it is practiced by a certain sect or church or movement. And one of the definitions I heard of religious freedom once, which I think is interesting, is that when we as a country choose to promote or discourage or even forbid certain practices, doing so on specifically ethnic or religious or sectarian grounds is itself an instance of theocracy.
Ooh.
If we agree as a society that a certain thing is bad, on terms and in a register that is equally accessible to everyone, then that is a definition of a secular democracy. It doesn't have to exclude religious reasoning, right? But it can't be solely limited to religious reasoning. So I made a point some weeks back about immigration. I don't have, in theory, a problem with the idea that we can have a conversation about restricting immigration. Where I have a problem is that most of those conversations seem to really actually be concerned with who is and isn't allowed into the country, which itself is saying, like you rightly pointed out, is really, it's a foreign policy or immigration policy conversation about who is and is not an American. So if someone comes up and says, we can't have Somalis in this country because they're African and Muslim and they don't share our values, like, hold on a second. As opposed to someone saying, maybe for economic reasons, maybe because of, some of the challenges, maybe just because the voters want to slow down the pace of immigration, as a general principle, that's a neutral principle. Again, that's a separate conversation. I don't want to get stuck in it, but that's the same thing with freedom of religion. If someone says that there is a practice that is genuinely discriminatory or causing harm, then absolutely we should go after it. But if the terms in which it's articulated are clearly targeted towards one religion, and then it's built in such a way that it's obviously not based on a shared moral principle or even just rational framework, right? So to your point, what about Islam makes it not a religion? Someone could say, oh, because, it's a political ideology. And I'd say, okay, but what does that mean? Muslims are trying to take over America. Yeah, but we already have rules for that.
Yeah.
we don't allow in the United States people to come take over our country, right? Like it's called national security, right? That's
Sure.
reality, right?
Yeah.
We also don't allow it domestically. That's called the Civil War, right? It was an act of treason and it was put down, right? That's what it was. That's a history that we have and countries deal with. But let's take, for example, the so-called Sharia courts. So in some instances, Muslims agree to arbitration according to shared moral principles. If you say you can't do that, then okay, but then what you're really saying is that people can't agree to arbitration under principles they freely decide, no matter what the principles are. Is that really what we're proposing? No, it's not. It's just, I just want to find a way to pick on Islam as a religion and then construct an argument based on my own bias and bigotry and what have you.
This is always challenging for me because on one hand, what I want to do is I want to complicate people's understanding of Islam and Muslims in general. And then sometimes I think, actually, that doesn't really matter at all, because what Greg Abbott doesn't give a shit about what the actual practice of Islam is. He just doesn't. I mean, he's looking for, as you say, a boogeyman. And the quickest way for me to get people rallied around me is for us to find a common enemy. And so what he's doing here is he's trying to raise up a scapegoat that people recognize, that people have seen before, and that he can call back to. We don't need to get into all the Rene Girard scapegoating thing, but I would just like to hear you say just for a second, in terms of how you think about human nature, is scapegoating a core part of how you think humans are tempted to act in the world? Is he appealing, I don't know, in the Christian world, we would say, to a part of our fallen nature and how he is constructing his political ideology?
I do want to answer that, but I want to go back to something you said, because it is really important. It's a both and. So there are people in America who I think are not in the least motivated by Islamophobia, who might not understand why it's such a big deal, because they might not see the scale of the harm it's caused and continues to cause. The only reason we've been so closely tied to the Middle East is because it's easy to traffic in stereotypes.
Right.
Otherwise, it makes no sense. There's no real national security interest at play. What's the national security interest in endless war? None whatsoever. But it's easy to justify, and it's easy to line people's pockets, and it's easy to distract the public from real problems at home if you can point to a pre-existing stereotype. And so those two things are not disconnected. So actually, I think when a Mamdani or an Abdul Al-Sayed says New York first or Michigan first or America first, they're doing it in a principled way. There's a reason for that. There's also a part of me that wants to be like, dude, just grow up. Like, what is wrong with you? Why are you so afraid of everything? There's a new LDS church under construction, not far from our house. I don't look at it and panic and think the Mormons are taking over.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, okay, cool. They got a church. Okay. Like, why is that a big deal, right? You know what I'm saying, right? That's not
Yes,
really like,
I do know what you're saying.
Why are we so afraid of everything? On the one hand, you're preaching masculinity and strength, and on the other hand, you're scared of everything.
Uh-huh.
Right? What are we so afraid of? And I think there's two things happening in the register. The question you point to is, one, what's happening in human nature that allows us to prey on that? But then there's the actual preying on it. And here I mean P-R-E-Y, not P-R-A-Y, right?
That's a good double entendre, though. You could work out something with that. Yeah,
there's definitely like a Substack subheading, pray for us, not on us. But that's where I think the difference is the people who are your audience and then what's actually happening in your head. And I think the fallen nature part of it is actually very interesting. Is it weird if I get into a tangent about capitalism and socialism?
We always go there. So
we always go there.
It.
We do.
Go for it.
One of the reasons I find materialist explanations of reality and human nature insufficient is because sometimes we assume that problems happen because people don't have enough resources or money.
Mm-hmm.
And there is something to that. Obviously, it's hard to focus on building collectively when we are struggling individually. And so by no means am I proposing that we shouldn't look after and take care of each and all of us. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, why is it that people with so much power are either themselves so insecure or so keen to have even more power? Is there not a point at which one would say, this is enough, I am secure? And I think that actually points to a lack of faith.
Of course.
And a deep deficiency in faith, and not in the sense of, I don't understand my own faith correctly, which is, I mean, so you can speak to the Christian element or the unchristian element of this kind of Christianity, but in the sense of, I don't actually believe God provides and takes care of me. I have a fundamentally insecure view of the world in which there is no trust in God or providence. And so even though I am the majority, I have a mindset of scarcity. And maybe that's too generous. Maybe it's just predatory and there's nothing more to it. But I think there's something to that we ought to be able to talk about. I think a more moral response is, there are problems and challenges all around us. How do we resolve them according to our values? Not, I'm afraid, let me make you afraid, or you're afraid and let me prey on that fear.
Yeah. The number one thing that Jesus told his followers was to not fear, to not be afraid. I agree with you that we should be eager to protect religious freedom in our country. And I also think that outside of whose rights are protected or not protected, that the conversation that I think that you and I are interested in is trying to encourage, trying to cultivate religious sensibility, religious imagination that is defined outside of fear. that is defined by moral aspirations, by an orientation towards hope and possibility and faith. And I think when you are collapsed into what you're afraid of, it calls out the worst parts of you. It almost forces you to find people who could take advantage of that, of the thing that you're afraid of.
David French had an op-ed in the Times where he encouraged, I think it was Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy, to send his daughter to Harvard. And this clip has gone pretty viral, I think, in the last few days, where, if I'm right about it, her parents tell her, or at least her father tells her, why she shouldn't go to Harvard. And French responded in a way that actually I found very meaningful, because he said, look, I'm a parent and I'm a Christian and I'm religious. And I'm sure every parent thinks about this when their kid goes out into the world. How do they keep their faith? How do they stay strong? How do we protect them from harm? And if you are a person of faith, then harm can include spiritual harm. And of course it does, right? So you want your child and certainly your daughter to be in a place where she's taken care of, where she can be challenged, but she's also safe. That's normal human instinct. And he says something in there that I thought was really beautiful. He says, it's good to be in a place where you are challenged and forced to think about what you believe. And if you are not challenged and forced to think about what you believe, then you become brittle and insecure.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think some of it is absolutely the cultivation, and I really hear what you're saying, a certain mindset, but some of it is also just like religion. What are the practices that actually build confidence? What are the practices that actually build security? What are the habits and communities that can make us feel that way? And I think that's something we actually really struggle with as a country. I don't think this wave of Islamophobia will have the effect previous waves did, because I think people are just really tired and frustrated.
Yeah, they're tired of it.
It's just, at this point, it's so deeply and nakedly insincere and irrelevant. What does that have to do with my electricity prices? What does that have to do with, I want my kids to, go out into the world, get married, have families, have thriving lives. I want to be able to live long enough to be a grandparent. I want to have health insurance, right? And it doesn't speak to any of that. So I think it's really a question of, we know, and we've talked about this before, we know that a lot of folks who speak in the name of religion aren't really advancing religion. I think the question is, what are we doing in their stead?
Before we go, here's one more story from Haroon.
Earlier this year, I attended a conference in New York City on religion and government. And it was my first time in New York in many months, maybe a year or two. And it was a weird feeling to be back in a place where you lived so long that's so different than the place you live in now. And so I was there, and I was both excited and I was overwhelmed, and I thought I missed this place. But also I thought to myself, I don't miss this place because I like living in Ohio, where I don't have to look for parking. And if I walk into a cafe, I don't have to fight for a seat. But I left early to go back to the airport because I didn't want to deal with rush hour. So I got to LaGuardia, which is, by the way, a beautiful airport now. And it was time to pray. And the chapel is not explicitly Christian, but pretty Christian. And so I located the chapel, and then I had to go do wudu. I had to do ablution, which meant I had to wash myself in the bathroom, wash my face and my hair. And I don't really have hair, but where my hair would have been, I should say, right? And as I walked into the bathroom, I said, oh God, this is always so awkward. This is just so weird. And then afterwards, I always make sure to wipe up after myself so there's no water that's spilled anywhere. And then as I walked into the bathroom, I said, wait a minute. Zohran Mamdani is mayor. I got nothing to hide anymore. I don't have to be embarrassed. At no point did I say, case in point, it's time to take over New York City. It meant just, no, I'm part of this place. Like, I always have been, but now, I really know I am. So I was like, thanks, Zohran Mamdani. And I did ablution. And it was a good feeling, and I think people don't get that that's really the feeling most people want, is I'm part of this. Not I'm here to impose myself on you, but I can be here too. And I found a quiet corner of the chapel where I wouldn't be in anyone's way, and I prayed. And at no point did I freak out that, oh my God, I'm praying in a Christianist chapel, and why isn't there a mosque here? I was like, no, I just want a place to pray where I can quietly pray, and that's more than enough for me, and I'm out.
Thanks for listening. And thanks to Zach Swellbar for recording our theme music. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and let us know what questions we should be asking and who else we should be talking to.